Moreton Bay Council says its new campground will give people sleeping rough somewhere safer and more dignified to stay, but the Queensland Government says it was blindsided by the decision and has serious concerns about the plan. A new analysis has compared driving and public transport journeys into Brisbane from 205 suburbs, but how many are actually faster by public transport depends heavily on how long we allow drivers to find a park and walk to their destination. And Ipswich has conditionally committed $2.5 million towards a proposed synthetic athletics track inside a state school, while athletes using the city's existing track say it's falling apart. We'll also look at Brisbane and Logan's use of AI to help spot swimmers in trouble, a long-term plan to reshape Kedron Brook, and a long-awaited bikeway into Wong. I'm Adam and this is the Brisbane Channel. We may not be the fastest to get the stories out, but that's so we can bring the depth those stories deserve beyond just the headlines. This video is sponsored by YB Painting, Brisbane's painting specialists and long-time supporters of the Brisbane Channel. More about them and the exclusive discount they have for channel viewers later, but first, a controversial attempt to manage homelessness in Moreton Bay that could now be heading towards a confrontation with the Queensland Government. The City of Moreton Bay has unanimously approved a 12-month trial of a free campground at Wyllie Park in Petrie, where about a dozen people are reportedly already sleeping rough. The plan would create 60 designated sites with mandatory registration, conditions of use, and procedures governing how the campground operates. It's expected to accommodate tents, along with a limited number of caravans or camper trailers. Although it has widely been described as a homeless camp, Council says the campground will technically be available to anyone. It will be voluntary and free to use, including for people who can't afford a commercial campground or access crisis accommodation. Wyllie Park already has an overnight camping area, toilets and rubbish facilities. Council plans to add more cameras and security patrols before opening the expanded campground, which it originally expected to do within 3 weeks. Mayor Peter Flannery says this is not a substitute for crisis accommodation or permanent housing. Instead, Council argues that people are already sleeping in its parks, and bringing some of that camping into one managed location would give it greater control over numbers, behaviour and public health. Council received almost 4,000 complaints about people staying in parks and public spaces during the last financial year. Councillor Jim Maloney also cited Queensland Government figures showing that the number of people at risk of or experiencing homelessness on Moreton Bay's social housing register increased from 1,641 in June 2023 to 3,147 in March this year. But the Queensland Government says it was not consulted before Council made its decision. Housing Minister Sam O'Connor says the government learnt about the plan through the council's media release and would have raised serious concerns if it had been approached. His main concern is the concentration of people with very different and often complex needs at one location. That could include people experiencing mental illness, addiction, domestic violence, physical health problems, or recent release from prison. The Minister has also described Council's allocation of one ranger to work with people experiencing homelessness as completely inadequate, and has asked Council to explain how it intends to manage the site. He hasn't, however, announced the Queensland Government will stop the trial. Council's own report acknowledges a risk that the Department of Resources or the responsible minister could take a different view about Council's ability to manage the campground through a land management plan. Natural Resources Minister Dale Last has so far declined to say whether the state will intervene. The response from homelessness organisations has been mixed. Encircle Community Services has welcomed the prospect of greater stability near support services, while Q Shelter warns that concentrating people without adequate services and safeguards could create serious challenges. Nourish Street founder Bo Haywood has similar concerns about mixing families, older people, vulnerable women, and people experiencing mental illness or addiction, and says the campground must remain genuinely voluntary rather than becoming a permanent holding area. Those concerns are partially relevant because Council expects Queensland Government agencies and support providers to be regular visitors, helping campers obtain services and work towards longer-term housing. The state's claim that it was not consulted raises an obvious question about how much of that support had actually been arranged before the decision was made. There's also some important history here. In March, the Queensland Supreme Court found Council had violated the human rights of homeless campers evicted from public parks, including by failing to provide reasonable time before enforcement and disposing of possessions without consent. The judgment didn't prevent Council enforcing camping restrictions in future, but it did require that enforcement occur lawfully and properly consider people with nowhere else to go. Wyllie Park represents a very different approach, designates somewhere people can legally stay while continuing to manage camping elsewhere. But there's plenty that remains unresolved. The trial's operation cost has not been quantified, the state has not committed to the support Council expects, and it's unclear whether the proposed land management arrangements will face intervention by the state. A managed campground may be safer and more dignified than repeatedly shifting people between parks, but it's still not housing, and without appropriate services, concentrating vulnerable people in one location could create a different set of risks. I also sent a number of questions to the City of Moreton Bay about the proposal. They told me they were working on a response, but I hadn't received it by the time I recorded this. Once they've come back to me, I'll share their response in next week's video. And if you value local reporting that follows up those unanswered questions, not just the original announcements, you can help support the channel by becoming a member or making a one-off contribution through Buy Me a Coffee. It's support like that that helps keep this channel alive. The links are here and in the description, and every contribution helps me put more time into researching stories like these. Separate to the debate around the Wyllie Park campground, the Queensland Government has now called for construction tenders for a permanent supported housing project aimed specifically at young people in Moreton Bay. The Moreton Bay Youth Foyer will provide 40 self-contained units in Redcliffe for young people aged 16 to 25 who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Residents will pay around 25% of their income in rent and receive 24-hour support while they're completing education, training, or work. The idea is to give them both stable accommodation and the skills they'll need to live independently. The government bought the site last year and says it's close to public transport, services, employment, and TAFE. Brisbane architecture firm Archifield has been appointed to design it. But the exact address still hasn't been publicly identified, and there's no announced construction cost, builder, opening date, or support provider. The government says all 8 of its new youth foyers will either be completed or under construction by 2028. So this won't solve the broader homelessness crisis, and its 40 places are aimed at a very specific group. But it does offer something the Wyllie Park campground can't: purpose-built accommodation with support built in. Now from housing to a question almost everyone who travels into Brisbane has probably asked: am I actually better off driving or taking public transport? Go There Brisbane has tried to answer that by comparing journeys from every gazetted suburb with its centre within 20 kilometres of Brisbane Central, 205 suburbs altogether. And at first glance, public transport comes out looking surprisingly competitive. Of the 199 suburbs with a practical service, public transport beats the car in 72. It comes within 10 minutes of driving in 152, and the median public transport journey is 46 minutes, just 4 minutes slower than the car. Some of the strongest results are in suburbs along train lines. From Chelmer, the comparison is 19 minutes by train versus 41 by car. It's 18 versus 35 from Northgate and 17 versus 33 from Taringa. Bowen Hills has the quickest public transport trip at 9 minutes, while at the other end, Larapinta takes more than 2 hours. 6 semi-rural or industrial suburbs have no practical public transport journey into the city at all. So how did Go There formulate these figures? Both journeys start from the suburb's population-weighted centre, a point weighted towards where residents are concentrated rather than simply the geographic middle. For public transport, Google was asked for the fastest door-to-door journey arriving at Brisbane Central by 9 a.m. on an ordinary school term Tuesday, including walking, waiting, and time on board. Driving uses Google's typical morning peak forecast, plus 8 minutes to find a park and walk to the destination. And that parking allowance makes a big difference. With no parking time, public transport wins in only 28 suburbs. Add 4 minutes and it becomes 43, 8 minutes gives us 72, and at 12 minutes, public transport wins in 102 suburbs. So this isn't a universal answer. Your result will differ if you have a reserved CBD car park, live beside a station, or simply arrive at public transport without timing your trip to the timetable. The analysis also uses scheduled services rather than taking into account actual delays, cancellations, or overcrowding, while the driving forecasts weren't repeatedly tested. So differences of a minute or two probably shouldn't be read too closely. What this analysis does show is how uneven access is across Brisbane. Only 31% of the suburbs studied have a train station within a 10-minute walk of their population centre, while 58% rely entirely on buses. A broader Climate Council analysis found that only 33.7% of people in Brisbane's wider urban area lived within 800 metres of public transport running at least every 15 minutes from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That was the lowest level of access among Australia's 5 largest capital cities. And when it compared different socio-economic areas, access in Brisbane's lower income communities was 27% lower than in its wealthier communities. That study used the ABS-defined Brisbane urban area, which stretches across council boundaries. It also measured access to frequent services throughout the day, rather than the speed of one morning journey into the CBD, so the figures aren't directly comparable. But both studies point to the same broader divide. Where people live close to a train line or a frequent service, public transport can be genuinely competitive with driving, even before we consider fuel, tolls, and parking costs. Move away from those corridors and the options get much weaker very quickly. A quick shout out to channel sponsor YB Painting. If you're planning on updating your home or workspace, I highly recommend you get in touch with YB. The multi-award winning team offer fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on their work, so you know exactly what you're getting up front. You can claim your exclusive 10% discount by scanning the QR code on screen or through the link in the description. Now from comparing our commutes to technology watching over our swimming pools. Brisbane City Council is preparing to trial artificial intelligence at Runcorn Aquatic Centre and Yeronga Park Memorial Swimming Pool, with cameras watching for movement or behaviour that could indicate someone is in trouble. If the system spots something concerning, it sends an alert to a lifeguard smartwatch showing them where to look. The key point is that this isn't replacing lifeguards. The technology can raise an alarm, but it can't check on a swimmer, pull someone from the water, or administer first aid. Council says Runcorn and Yeronga were chosen because of their patronage, different layouts and visibility conditions, as well as interest from the private operators that run the pools. The system doesn't use facial recognition. Council says it analyses movement and behaviour patterns with footage stored on a local server controlled by each pool operator and automatically deleted within 7 days. The trial has been announced as running for 12 months, with installation expected over the coming months, although Council hasn't provided exact dates. It also won't reveal the capital or ongoing cost, saying that information is commercially sensitive. But Brisbane isn't the first local council in the region to try this technology. Logan installed the same link sight system at Gould Adams Park Aquatic Centre in Kingston in November 2024 and has now given the Brisbane Channel some early operating figures. Council says the system generated 2,754 alerts across more than 140,000 visits, with 4 alerts followed by water rescues, roughly 1 alert for every 51 visits. But because the system is deliberately highly sensitive, an alert doesn't necessarily mean someone was drowning or even needed help. Logan hasn't provided a breakdown of genuine distress versus false alerts, whether any incidents were missed, response time data, or a formal assessment of lifeguard workload. Council says feedback has been positive and has expanded link site to Beenleigh, with Logan North next in line. Brisbane plans to develop its own reporting framework covering alerts, lifeguard responses, operational effects, and safety benefits, although it hasn't said whether the eventual findings will be made public. That framework will be important because 4 rescues following alerts in Logan sounds encouraging, but it isn't enough to establish accuracy or overall effectiveness. A useful evaluation needs verified incidents, false and missed alerts, response times, and workforce impacts, especially if ratepayers are eventually being asked to fund a wider rollout. The technology may prove to be a valuable extra layer of protection, but until those questions are answered, what we have is promising early figures rather than proof of how well the system performs overall. Staying with Brisbane City Council, we now have a clearer idea of how much its 20-year vision for Kedron Brook could involve. Council expects at least $85 million to be invested along the 29-kilometre corridor over the next 2 decades. The draft vision stretches from Upper Kedron towards Moreton Bay and was shaped by more than 1,500 pieces of feedback gathered during the first round of consultation. Some of its bigger ideas are about making the brook more resilient when it floods. That includes potentially replacing the concrete channel through Greater Park with a more natural vegetated waterway. The aim would be to slow the water down, reduce erosion, and improve water quality, similar to what's been done at Hanlon Park in Stones Corner. Council also wants to investigate raising or widening some bridges, moving vulnerable paths further away from eroding banks, improving road crossings, and extending connections into surrounding suburbs and public transport. At Terralba Park, there could be a broader redesign to move sporting facilities away from the areas most exposed to flooding. Then there are the everyday additions: more toilets, drinking fountains, seating, lookouts, and dog-friendly facilities, along with opportunities for businesses to face and connect with the brook. But this is still a draft vision, not a list of projects that are all designed, approved, and fully funded. Council says at least $15 million is already allocated over the next several years. The Lord Mayor has also promised more funding in next year's budget, with further work expected to begin in roughly 12 months. Exactly how much extra money will be added and which ideas will move first won't be clear until the vision is finalised. Consultation remains open until Sunday the 6th of September, with an online survey and information kiosks being held at different locations along the brook. I've linked those details below. And in another part of the city, a missing link in Brisbane's cycling network is finally moving closer to construction. Council has selected a continuous 2-way separated bikeway as the preferred design for Sylvan Road and Land Street in Toowong. It'll connect the Western Freeway bikeway with the Bicentennial Bikeway, separating people riding and scooting from traffic along a section where they're currently pushed into a narrow and busy road corridor. The preferred option received stronger community support than a design that mixed one-way and two-way sections. It includes new traffic lights and safer crossings, wider footpaths, and better connections to public transport, parks, and local businesses. The concept released for consultation would also make part of Sylvan Road one-way for cars, reduce the speed limit to 40 kilometres an hour, and remove some on-street parking. But those details still need to be confirmed in the final design, which Council says it'll release later this year. Cyclist safety here isn't a minor safety issue. Between 2002 and 2023, there were 43 crashes involving cyclists on Sylvan Road, with 19 people admitted to hospital. Bicycle Queensland says it has been campaigning for a separated bikeway here for at least 25 years. Construction on the bikeway is expected to begin around the middle of 2027. Related work at the Milton Road, Croydon Street and Morley Street intersection has already started and should be finalised early next year, weather and site conditions permitting. The broader project is jointly funded by the federal and state governments and Brisbane City Council. And from a long-awaited bikeway in Toowong, we're heading west to Ipswich and a sporting facility debate in Ripley. The council has conditionally committed $2.5 million toward a synthetic athletics track at Ripley Valley State Secondary College. Councillors unanimously backed the proposal from Providence Athletics on the 5th of August. The club is seeking another $2.5 million through the Queensland Government's Games On Partnership Fund, which would create a $5 million project. But Ipswich City Council has now confirmed that when councillors made their decision, they hadn't received a business case, technical assessments, or full costings for the Ripley proposal. So while the project has been presented as a $5 million track, Council didn't have the detailed documents needed to independently verify its feasibility or final price before committing its share. Council's resolution makes its contribution conditional on an agreement being reached with the Department of Education to ensure community use of the proposed facility. But Council's response doesn't explain what further due diligence will need to be completed before that agreement is signed or any funding is provided. And the access condition is more complicated than it might sound. Providence already operates at the school under a joint use development agreement approved last year, with infrastructure funded by the club and used by both the school and community groups. But the Education Department hasn't endorsed this new track. It says any additional infrastructure or access arrangement must go through formal engagement and be assessed on its merits. If built on school land, the track would become an Education Department asset with access, maintenance, and operations governed by agreements between the school and community users. Those agreements could determine things like booking priorities, hours, fees, and maintenance contributions. Standard school hire agreements generally run for up to 12 months, although some longer joint use development agreements run for 10 years. So meaningful long-term access is possible, but nothing has been finalised. We still don't know how other clubs could use the track, whether they could hold full carnivals, what they'd pay, or what happens when school and community bookings clash. Providence Athletics has declined to discuss its application for now, although it says more information may be released with the school in the next few weeks. The Department of Sport also won't comment on individual Games On applications. It says the initial assessment process has finished and applicants invited to progress to Stage 2 have been notified. But because neither the department nor Providence will discuss this application, we can't say whether the Ripley proposal has advanced to Stage 2. Council also didn't answer why its own Games On application for an athletics facility wasn't progressed after a workshop on the 4th of August, or whether the program's delivery deadline was a deciding factor. A second special meeting had been called for the 11th of August to continue discussing the track, but that meeting didn't proceed. There's no debate over whether Ipswich needs better athletics facilities. The consensus is that it does. Bill Patterson Oval at Limestone Park has been the city's athletics home for almost 50 years and is still used by Ipswich Little Athletics and Ipswich and District Athletic Club. But it has a grass track built over a former rubbish tip. Council has previously acknowledged the uneven surface, poor drainage, continuing ground movement, and need for urgent maintenance. Council had also been advocating for a new national standard synthetic track on council-controlled land with an estimated cost of about $20 million. Importantly, Council now says it hasn't made a final decision on the location of that council-owned track. Confidential investigations into possible sites will continue even while it supports the separate Providence application. It'll also investigate what work should be delivered at Bill Patterson Oval in the short and medium term, although no scope, budget, or timetable has been announced. So there are still three big questions: whether Providence secures state funding and passes the necessary scrutiny, whether community access can be properly guaranteed, and whether Council eventually builds its own national standard track while addressing the immediate problems at Bill Patterson Oval. Council has committed up to $2.5 million, but most of the decisions determining whether the Ripley proposal works for the wider athletics community are still ahead. Ipswich isn't the only part of Greater Brisbane facing some big decisions about how growth will be supported. In the Redlands, consultation is underway on the Southern Thornlands Priority Development Area, an 890-hectare area planned for about 8,000 homes and up to 24,000 people, alongside employment land, 3 schools, 11 parks, and more than 150 hectares of green space. But as with most developments of this scale, one of the biggest questions is who pays for all the infrastructure? Documents released for consultation estimate it could cost around $544 million. That includes roughly $256 million for roads and transport, $137 million for sewerage, $93 million for parks and community facilities, and another $58 million for water and stormwater infrastructure. But that doesn't mean all of that money has been funded. The consultation material identifies possible mechanisms such as developer charges and infrastructure agreements, but it doesn't lock in who'll pay for every project or when each piece of infrastructure will be delivered. Redland City Council says it supports the delivery of more housing, but it doesn't want the cost of supporting the new community shifted onto existing ratepayers. It's now encouraging residents to have their say directly through the state government's consultation process. The formal notification period runs until September 15, with community information sessions also being held at Victoria Point and Thornlands. After that, the submissions will be considered before the final development scheme is expected to go to the Minister for Economic Development Queensland for a decision in October. So at this stage, Southern Thornlands is still just a proposal, and the final development scheme, infrastructure commitments, and funding arrangements haven't been settled. And from one huge proposed development to another big idea, this time a new 5-day food market planned for Hamilton. A developer is planning to turn an office building at 5 Hercules Street in North Shore, Hamilton, into a large undercover food market. Hamilton Markets is being modelled loosely on Melbourne's Queen Victoria Market, with plans to operate 5 days a week from Wednesday to Sunday. The proposed mix includes fresh produce, meat, seafood and dairy, alongside specialty retailers, artisan producers, hot food vendors and beverage traders. There'd also be a relaxed bar operating later in the day, as well as cooking demonstrations, seasonal festivals and local entertainment. The team is now seeking expressions of interest from potential vendors and hospitality operators, with an opening targeted for March next year. Developer Steve Urquhart recently bought the building for $8 million after purchasing the neighbouring property at 9 Hercules Street for $17 million. Together, the properties cover just over 3,200 square metres, and the combined site already has approval for a 189 apartment tower. The market team talks about establishing a permanent mix of vendors, but the agent involved in the sale described the market as a way to activate the site in the short term while preserving the longer-term residential development potential. So it's not clear how long the market itself is intended to remain. But if it does open as planned, it would create a relatively unusual Brisbane offering, a large all-weather food market operating most of the week. This week, I sat down with Nightlife Economy Commissioner John J.C. Collins to chat about Brisbane's nightlife, what's holding it back, and what changes we should be making as we move toward 2032 and beyond. I expect that podcast episode will be out next week, so keep your eye out for that. I'm also still working on some of the other videos I've promised recently. If you want to be involved in what we do here on the Brisbane channel, this video is my invitation to you to be a part of the channel's next exciting chapter. See you there, 'cause we're done.